battlefield of Gettysburg, where on July 1st to 3rd, 1863, the turning point of the Civil War was fought. Today we're going to go around the battlefield, look at some of the landmarks, and learn a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg.
Okay.
We're now standing on McPherson's Ridge, where behind me, 20,000 United States cavalry troops positioned themselves along the fence. 27,000 Confederate troops came from the Chambersburg Pike, the road also behind me, and hit the United States cavalry troops. The U.S. troops fell back to the hills behind you and reformed. They hoped to stop the Confederate advance there. Where we're standing now is where most of the action took place on July 1st. The 27,000 Confederate infantry troops we were talking about a few minutes ago came down this way towards me. Another large number of Confederate infantry troops, Major General Jubal Early commanding, came down at a 45-degree angle behind me, hitting United States cavalry and infantry troops below us. Brigadier General John Buford commanded the cavalry, and Major General John Reynolds commanded the infantry. Reynolds was shot and killed, and Abner Doubleday, who was later to invent the game of baseball, took his command. Tired and outnumbered, the United States troops fell back this way towards Culp's Hill, where they hoped to stop the Confederate advance the next day. Artillery and infantry occupied the low wooded ridge I am standing on, Cemetery Ridge, July 2nd and 3rd. Union forces defended Cemetery Ridge, the parallel ridge 3/4 of a mile in front of me. In between lay the Emmitsburg Road and fields crisscrossed with fences. About 1 p.m. the third day, Confederate cannon along this ridge opened fire. For 2 hours, more than 270 cannon thundered, creating a scene one correspondent called a very hell of fire that amazed the oldest officers. About 3 p.m. the cannonade ceased, and Confederate infantry commanded by Brigadier General James G. Pettigrew and Major General Isaac Trimble formed ranks in the fields behind me, marched through these trees, and advanced out across the field in front of me. To my right, other Confederates under Major General George E. Pickett did the same. The ill-fated assault, commanded by Lieutenant General James G. Longstreet, would come to be known as Pickett's Charge. At the Virginia Monument, which offers a Confederate eye view of Pickett's Charge. Later in our tour, we'll show you the Union eye view of Pickett's Charge. Private Randolph Shortwell, 8th Virginia Infantry in the Confederate Army, described Pickett's Charge this way. The flags flutter and snap. The sunlight flashes from the officers' swords. Low words of command are heard, and thus in perfect order, this gallant array of gallant men marches straight down into the Valley of Death. Now I'm going to explain to you what happened during Pickett's Charge. About 3 p.m., following a furious 2-hour cannonade, Confederate infantry launched a massive frontal assault from this ridge against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge ahead. The Confederates who comprised this section of the line were Virginians, commanded by Major General George E. Pickett. The Southern attackers, 12,000 strong, surged forward in a line of battle a mile long. As they marched across the Emmitsburg Road and approached the enemy line, the Federals raked them with deadly canister and musket fire. Nevertheless, with unsurpassed courage, the Southerners pressed on. Pickett's men gained a small lodgment in the Union line at the angle, but could not hold it. Casualties mounted, and the attack lost momentum. By 4 p.m., Confederate survivors came streaming back to the shelter of this ridge. The Confederate tide had reached its high water mark. General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, accepted responsibility for the failure of Pickett's charge. "This has been my fault," he told Pickett. "I thought my men were invincible." The famous assault was named for Major General George E. Pickett, who commanded 3 Virginia brigades. In response to General Longstreet's fatal order, Pickett replied, "General, I shall leave my division on." I'm still on the Confederate side. Now we're a little closer towards the Union, where the Union line would have been. Behind me you can see the Virginia monument that we were just standing at a couple minutes ago. And now I'm going to tell you about what happened after Pickett's charge. Lieutenant Thomas C. Holland commanded Company G, 28th Virginia Infantry. Shouting, "Come on, boys!" Holland broke through the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. He fell moments later when a bullet pierced his cheek and excited through the back of his head. He was later carried to a Union field hospital and later recovered. Of the 88 men in his company who took part in Pickett's charge, 81 were listed as killed, wounded, or missing that night. 50 years after the battle, Holland returned to the spot where he fell and shook the hand of the Union soldier who had shot him. As the Confederates streamed back across the field from their failed assault, General Robert E. Lee rode out to meet them. "It has been all my fault," he was heard to say. The attack had cost his army nearly 6,000 casualties. With the failure of Pickett's charge, Lee sensed his opportunity was gone. His men were exhausted, and the number of dead, wounded, and missing was enormous. They could no longer take the offensive. The following day, July 4th, Lee's men held their position on the ridge behind me, but the Federals did not attack. That evening, Lee gave the order to retreat. The retreat began in heavy rain that soaked the downcast Southern troops. The high spirits that had carried them into Pennsylvania were dashed on the bloody, sodden fields of Gettysburg. Now, where we are right now is on the southernmost edge of the Confederate line. This is their right flank. This is where their line ended on the right. What we're looking at behind me is 2 hills. A large steep one with trees on top known as Big Round Top, and a small rocky one known as Little Round Top. The Confederate objective was to get one of these cannons on one of those hills. Why? Because the Union line ended at the end of Little Round Top, the little one. It started there. They wanted to get guns up there, turn the guns to their left, and begin to shoot down at the Union line. Now, if you look at the Big Round Top, which was larger and which was probably what they wanted to get, and you look at one of these cannons, that would have been a hard thing to do. The hill is too steep and there's too many trees. They would have had to push one of these guns up there and cut down trees. That would have taken a day at least, and it would have been dark before they would have been able to shoot. So what they wanted to do was get the guns up on the little rocky one, Little Round Top. Now where we're going to go is on top of the little rocky hill, Little Round Top, and take an eye view from what the Union soldiers were looking at. eye view of the Battle of Little Round Top. General Warren of the United States Army was the one who realized that they needed to defend Little Round Top. Confederate cannons were coming up the hill, and that was threatening their flank and their entire position. So we got some units up here. One of them being the 20th Maine. They positioned themselves along this hill, and Confederate infantry came up and were surprised to see Union troops. There had been no Union troops when they started. It was a hard journey coming up through these rocks. There was a fight in Devil's Den down below me, the large rocks. When they got to the top, they continued to hit the U.S. troops several times. Pretty soon the U.S. troops were running out of ammunition, they were tired, and their men were being shot and wounded very quickly. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, commanding the 20th Maine, was positioned on the extreme flank. He had to hold the flank. If he had left or let the Confederates by, the entire flank would have collapsed. He had about 250 men coming into the battle. Pretty soon the 20th Maine was running out of ammunition. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't leave. They couldn't get support. Everyone else was having troubles of their own. Pretty soon every man had fired his last shot. They didn't know what to do. Colonel Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge, which is where men stick bayonets like a knife on their musket, and they would run downhill. The plan was to come down at an angle and sweep the Confederates into the other U.S. units. They succeeded, and the Confederate attack was stopped. The day was saved. Behind me is the New York Monument, and now we're going to get a little more detailed and talk a little bit more about the defense of Little Round. Colonel Strong Vincent and his 1,300-man Union Infantry Brigade rushed to defend this hill about 4 p.m. on July 2nd, and none too soon. Just as his men took the position on the slopes below, Texans and Alabamians of Major General John B. Hood's division began streaming out of the woods to my left. Rapid, deadly fire from Vincent's line drove them back. Hood's determined men rallied and renewed the fight. When the Union right flank began to crumble, Colonel Vincent went to their aid. While thus exposed, he fell mortally wounded. Just when the Federals seemed doomed, over the hill behind me poured the 140th New York Infantry, led by Colonel Patrick O'Rourke. The New Yorkers, who had no time to load their muskets, swept down the hill in front of you into the surging Confederates. O'Rourke fell dead when a bullet pierced his neck. After a bloody struggle, the exhausted Southerners fell back, leaving Little Round Top in Union hands. Now I'd like to tell you about some of the Colonel Strong Vincent and Colonel Patrick O'Rourke. Colonel Strong Vincent, an attorney before the war, was only 26 when he was mortally wounded here. His decisive action in seizing Little Round Top prevented the destruction of the Union left flank. He died in a field hospital 5 days after the fight, perhaps unaware that he had been promoted to brigadier general. The gallant Colonel Patrick O'Rourke graduated first in his class at West Point in 1861. The 140th New York was his first combat command. Brigadier General G.K. Warren, who had sent O'Rourke into the fight here, lamented his death. I would have died to save him if I could. O'Rourke is honored on the monument behind me to my left. A little bit earlier in our tour, we talked about Pickett's Charge, which occurred on July 3rd, 1863. Right now we're talking about the battle that took place on July 2nd, 1863, and there's a reason for that. If this battle had been different, if Colonel Chamberlain and Colonel Patrick O'Rourke hadn't have made their charge, and the Confederates had taken this hill, Pickett's charge would not have taken place. J.E.B. Stuart, a cavalry commander, was waiting behind you and me. When the Confederates broke the line, he would have been waiting there to crush the U.S. troops. The stone wall behind me marks where the 20th Maine made its defense on Little Round Top. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the 20th Maine defense of Little Round Top. Late on the second day, the 358 men of the 20th Maine Volunteers found themselves anchoring the southern end of the Union line. If they could not stop the Confederate tide here, on the southern slopes of Little Round Top, the Federal line might be unhinged. For more than an hour, the waves of the Alabamians repeatedly stormed this hillside from below, but were repulsed each time. So deadly was the struggle that blood stood in puddles on the rocks. When the New Englanders' ammunition was nearly spent, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge that drove the Alabamians back for good, thus securing the Union left flank. The short walk in front of me, which we're about to take, leads us to the secluded 20th Maine Monument, a rest on ground Chamberlain was ordered to hold at all hazards. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a professor before the war, led the charge here that secured the Union left flank. For gallantry, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Later, he officiated at the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox and was elected the governor of Maine, which lost 343 men and 19 officers, nearly half their strength, in an attempt to dislodge the 20th Maine. His beloved brother, John, was hit by 6 bullets and fell mortally wounded here. Oates recalled, "The dead literally covered the ground." Now we're at the Pennsylvania Memorial, which is on the Union side of the line during Pickett's charge. On September 27, 1910, Pennsylvanians who had fought at Gettysburg returned for the dedication of this memorial in their honor. Built of Mount Airy granite, stands 110 feet high, weighs 3,840 tons, and can be seen from many parts of the battlefield. It is Gettysburg's largest monument. Listed on 90 bronze tablets along the base are the names of each of the 34,530 Pennsylvania soldiers who participated in the battle. Pennsylvania also erected 123 regimental monuments at other locations on the battlefield. The southern states did not provide monuments for each regiment, but honored their sons with the statewide memorials, many of which can be seen along the West Confederate Avenue. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the monument. On the very top stands the Goddess of Victory and Peace by Philadelphia sculptor Samuel Murray. This colossal bronze figure holds the sword of victory and the palm branch of little black soldiers on it. Above the triumphal arches are the massive granite bas-reliefs by Samuel Murray representing infantry, artillery, cavalry, and signal corps. To the right of that, the names of the distinguished Pennsylvania 400 officers and men. Names of soldiers who were killed are preceded by a star. We're now on the Union line at Pickett's Charge. Behind me is the Robert E. Lee the Virginia statue, which we were at earlier. Battery A, 4th United States Artillery, commanded by Lieutenant Alonzo H. Cushing, held this key position on the afternoon of July 3rd. The cannon and associated limbers and caissons in front of you mark the general location of Cushing's battery. At 1 p.m., as a prelude to Pickett's charge, about 130 Confederate cannon along Seminary Ridge, 3/4 of a mile to my left, opened the one and one half hour artillery duel with Union cannon here on Cemetery Ridge. It was the heaviest cannonade the continent had seen. Confederate shells took a toll on Cushing's battery, exploding ammunition chests, knocking wheels off cannon, and killing many horses. By the time enemy infantry reached the stone wall to my left, only one of Cushing's 6 guns remained in service. Wounded in the shoulder and groin, and held upright by a fellow officer, Cushing fired his last round of canister into the onrushing Confederates, then fell dead when a bullet entered his mouth. Moments later, Confederate Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead led his men over the wall and overran the battery. This is the objective of the Confederate attack at Pickett's Charge. It's as far as they got during the attack. Speaking of the Confederates who had executed Pickett's charge, General Lee reflected, "I never saw troops behave more magnificently. Yet, this last great assault at Gettysburg, among the greatest made by American soldiers, failed to crumble Union defenses." Hurrahs rose from the Union soldiers. Here as the Confederate tide ebbed. 12,000 Confederates had thrown themselves against the Union line. Nearly half had been killed, wounded, or captured. General Meade prepared his men for another attack on the 4th, but it never came. That night, Lee's army began its muddy retreat into Virginia. Years after the battle, Pickett's charge and its failure came to be known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. The war would continue for nearly 2 more years, but Lee's army of Northern Virginia would not invade the North again. A Union officer who had witnessed Pickett's charge wrote, "From that time on, the march of the rebellion was toward Appomattox." This is the high water mark monument. On one page on your left, it has the Confederate units that charged at Pickett's charge, and on your right you have the Union units. We're at the Gettysburg National Cemetery. This is where the soldiers was buried, and in November of that year, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln Address Memorial. This monument commemorates Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, November 19, 1863. The address was delivered about 300 yards from this spot, along the Upper Cemetery Drive. The site is now marked by the Soldiers' National Monument.